I don't think it would be an overstatement to say that the last 3 years have been some of the toughest of our lives. For many, they have been filled not just with fear and loss and brokenness and loneliness, but also a kind of uncertainty and instability that makes us question everything and everyone we thought we could rely on. But as dystopian as all of this is, there is a silver lining to it, which for me has been seeing people who somehow have the integrity of thought and the courage to stand by their convictions, even when it means standing out from the crowd in order to bring a little bit of sanity and moral conscience to a world which seems to be just going mad by the day. These are people who are saying, we aren't going to stand by and watch while our families are torn apart, while our children's futures are stolen. We're not going to allow our governments to terrorize us indefinitely, and we won't be ushered into a world in which we no longer have the right to think for ourselves. While we have seen some of the worst forms of human behavior in our highest offices, and unfortunately, from those closest to us, we have also seen people from all walks of life demonstrate incredible courage when faced with the toughest moral tests. There is perhaps no one who was in this fight earlier, or who fights it so bravely or endures ridicule so stably and elegantly than tonight's guest, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Son to former Senator and U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, and of course, nephew of President John F. Kennedy. Robert Kennedy Jr. is part of a family that helped to shape a world in which we had the luxury of taking freedom for granted. Mr. Kennedy is a graduate of Harvard University, the London School of Economics, and the University of Virginia. He negotiated the New York City Watershed Agreement, was senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and chief prosecuting attorney for the Hudson Riverkeeper. And for his success leading the fight to restore the Hudson River, he was named Time Magazine's one of the heroes for the planet. Mr. Kennedy is also chief legal counsel and chairman of the board of the Children's Health Defense, a nonprofit organization aiming to end childhood health epidemics. He is a best-selling author with many times over, with books on the New York Times bestseller list, including Crimes Against Nature, American Values, Lessons I Learned from My Family, and most recently, the one you're probably most familiar with, The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health. He has also had articles appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Rolling Stone. And you probably didn't know this, but Mr. Kennedy is also a children's book author, a licensed master falconer, and a whitewater paddling enthusiast, having led several expeditions in Canada and Latin America as fearlessly, I imagine, as he defends the environment and our children. This is who Robert Kennedy is on paper, but my experience has been that not even a resume as laudatory as this can reveal all, or even the most interesting things about a person. So it is my absolute honor to have the chance to sit down tonight and have a more intimate chat with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Please join me in welcoming tonight's guest. Do you know, I think there's so many things that our audience would love to hear your opinion about. I have so many things to ask you about. And I don't want to talk exclusively about COVID tonight, because I think there are so many things going on in our world. But let's start there anyway. I mean, now we're into the third year, right, since the World Health Organization declared the pandemic. And we're no better off, are we? And by many calculations, we're an awful lot worse off. We've had these lockdowns and vaccine mandates and mask mandates, and our families are torn apart, and society is more destabilized than it's been for so long. And now you can be an infected, vaccinated person and keep your job and show your vaccine passport to get into a restaurant, while an uninfected, unvaccinated person is getting fired and until very recently had to go and get takeout. You know, I mean, this is the world in which we live. Could you have imagined 3 years ago that we would have gotten here?
No, I could not. And a couple of things I would say for starters. One is to apologize for my voice. I have this condition called spasmodic dystonia that makes my voice cracky like this. And I had a very, very strong voice until I was 42 years old, and I got this disease. But usually, the good news is it usually clears up a little after I talk for a while. So I apologize to the audience for how it sounds, at least at the beginning, and I hope that it clears up. The other thing I would say is that before I got into the vaccine issue and even some overlapping, I spent about 37 years as an environmental lawyer working for Waterkeeper Alliance on the Hudson, but on 350 other waterways. And we had very, very strong programs in Canada, the Lake Ontario Lake Keeper, the Fraser River Keeper, and waterkeepers all over Canada. And I got to work in every province of Canada. During that time, I spent about 20% of my time in Canada working on environmental issues, litigating against Canadian and US companies for polluting the environment. I represented many of the tribal nations, the Cree, Northern Quebec, the Nuu-chah-nulth, and 5 other tribes on Vancouver Island in negotiations with McMillan Bloedel. And it was a great, great pleasure, probably the greatest joy of my career, that I got to spend so much time in Canada. It was a nation that I really loved. In answer to your question, I could not imagine how we got to where we are today. In 2001, we passed the Patriot Act in our country, and my political party, the Democratic Party, fought against it. My uncle, Ted Kennedy, fought against it. It was really this dream of the neocons to pursue this vision of the U.S. global hegemony after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in the process to turn America into a national security state, into essentially a police state. There were tremendous constrictions on constitutional rights, and it was a huge blow that it passed ultimately. But it passed in the wake of the fear and the orchestrated fear following 9/11. But at least we knew that most Americans, when they, in retrospect, opposed it, the polling all showed that in my political party there was huge opposition against it. And the baffling thing to me is that liberals, particularly, have collaborated with this dismantling that you spoke about, that happened in Canada and the US and liberal democracies globally, and this kind of lockstep assault, a coup d'etat, global coup d'etat against liberal democracy around the globe. And we saw in the United States the destruction in the last 20 months of virtually all the amendments to the United States Constitution. And as you point out, the beginning blow was the censorship, this blanket censorship that we see on social media and media against any voice that challenges official orthodoxies or official proclamations. that they're deplatformed, they're marginalized, they're gaslighted, doctors are delicensed, scientists are defunded, politicians are disappeared, and journalists are also, they're denied any kind of platform to talk about this. They began with the First Amendment. Madison, Hamilton, Adams all said we put freedom of speech in the First Amendment because, as you just said, Dr. Police, it is the most important right. If you take away a citizen's capacity to criticize their government, it gives the government license for virtually any atrocity. And as soon as they got rid of, and also democracies rely on free flow of information, on the triumph of ideas in the marketplace of ideas, so that the best ideas can become government policy. And if you eliminate that, you really kind of eliminate the major assumption of democracy that you're going to have a marketplace for debate. And we saw them once they got rid of freedom of speech, they went after, in our country, freedom of religion. They closed every church in the United States of America for a year with no public hearing, no scientific citation, nobody ever showing that it was going to impede the spread or the speed of the spread of the virus if we close those churches. And in the meantime, kept the liquor stores open as essential businesses. Now, I have nothing against that, but liquor stores are not the United States Constitution, and churches are. And there is no pandemic exception to the United States Constitution. And the framers knew about pandemics because during the Revolutionary War, there were two pandemics that bedeviled the patriot forces. The armies of New England, Washington's armies, were sidelined for almost 2 months because of a smallpox outbreak. And the Army of Virginia, which was the other major army, was devastated by a malaria epidemic. So they knew all about epidemics, but they opted not to put that in the United States Constitution as an exception to our Bill of Rights. Then they got rid of the right to assembly by passing all these social distancing mandates, again, without due process, with no hearing, no public hearing, no environmental impact statement, no demonstration of the science that this was actually a beneficial mandate. They then got rid of freedom, they got rid of the property rights. They closed 3.3 million businesses in our country with no due process and no just compensation, which are provided for by the Fourth Amendment. They got rid of jury trials. They passed the CARES Act and the PrEP Act. Here's what the Seventh Amendment says: no American citizen shall be deprived of his right to a trial before a jury of his peers in any case or controversy exceeding $25 in value. That's all it says. It's very simple. There is no exception. If somebody harms you, you are entitled to a jury trial. Well, the legislature's not allowed to override that. You need a constitutional amendment. But here we had Tony Fauci, who has been in that office for 50 years, who has never been elected. He has no democratic accountability. And he simply said, we're going to close every business in America. He didn't show a single scientific study to justify that. It turned out to be a globally, to have global implications, because we were setting policy in our country that everybody adopted around the globe. There's no public hearings anywhere. It was simply ordered. We got rid of all of these prohibitions that we have against track and trace surveillance, against warrantless searches and seizures with all of these new intrusions on our privacy. And we got rid of due process of law. Here's what the United States Constitution says. If you want to pass a law in the country and the legislature votes on the law, then that's all they need to do. They vote on it, and it's law. And the remedy for that, if you don't like that law, is to vote out that legislature. But there are special democratic controls when a regulatory agency passes a regulation, because Congress and the courts have said they can't do that. You can't have unelected bureaucrats imposing laws on people without democratic controls. So there's a process, and for 40 years, I've been suing public agencies and I've been suing big polluters for trying to escape that process, for trying to do end runs around that process. And here's what that process is. Before a regulator passes a law or passes a regulation, promulgates a regulation, they have to publish the proposed rule in a newspaper of record and other newspapers all around the country, so that it's highly likely that anybody affected by the rule will see it reported in a newspaper. Number two, they have to publish an environmental impact statement, a regulatory impact statement, and an economic impact statement that lays out all the scientific studies, all the economic studies, and does a cost-benefit analysis that shows that the benefits of that regulation will exceed the cost. It also has to demonstrate that there are no alternatives that are cheaper or less burdensome. None of that was done. The next thing they do is they have to have a public comment period where anybody who is impacted by those laws gets to send a letter and commenting on it, and the government has to respond to every one of those comments. Oh, if you're a kayak company, let's say, and you write a comment that says, listen, the mandate should not be applied to my company because if I make my clients wear masks while they're kayaking, it's highly likely they will drown. And the government then has to respond and explain why it either is making an exception for that business or justifying it. None of that was done. And then they have to have a public hearing where Tony Fauci brings in all of his experts that he relies on, lays out all the science that he relies on, and then we get to bring our experts and we get to cross-examine his experts. And there's a decision by a neutral administrative law judge that is based upon the evidence. It can't be arbitrary and capricious, and you can appeal that decision. So there's all these democratic controls. None of that happened. You just had one guy who's never been elected, who just says, 1 week he says masks don't work, they're ridiculous, and then 2 weeks later he says everybody strap one on. He never gives us a scientific basis, a scientific citation. He just says, I've changed my mind. And then 2 weeks after that, he says, put 2 of them on. So that's how the complete obliteration of democratic process. The only amendment that they didn't touch was the Second Amendment. But all the other ones were essentially dismantled. We saw American democracy dismantled in a single year. And what I said to people is, we need to understand that there are worse things than dying. Okay, there were worse things than dying, and that's a hard thing for people to understand. But one of those things is the loss of our freedom. And when I say that, I'm saying it because there was a generation of Americans in 1776 who said that. And we are living with the Bill of Rights because they were willing to lay down their lives, their property, their families, everything they owned, everything they had, including their existence, in order to make sure that we had these rights in the Bill of Rights. And now, in 20 months, because of the fear of a germ, we've given up all those rights. We've relinquished them.
Well, this is the thing that's so shocking, right? I mean, it's one thing for someone like Anthony Fauci to assume a kind of authoritarian control, but that wouldn't accomplish what we've seen happen over the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, the point you're making, I think, is that it's people's fear that have allowed them to do whatever he and people like him have said. And one thing I think is becoming clear in the narrative is that people feel as though they have a right to feel safe, right? A right to be protected from other people, but even just a right to feel that they're safe from other people. Is there any notion in your mind in a democracy that we have any kind of right like that?
Well, I don't disagree that people ought to feel safe. The question is, really, I think the real issue is the issue that you alluded to, which is that people gave up this power, this essential power to be sovereign over our own lives, over our conduct, over our community, as the result of orchestrated fear. And I show in my book how the data was cherry-picked and manipulated in order to keep people in a constant state of fear. And Franklin Roosevelt, who was the father of liberal democratic ideology in our country, probably the most important statement, the most well-known statement in his litany of wonderful wisdom, was his admonition to the American people that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The reason he said that was because he understood that fear is a tool that totalitarian elements use to impose autocratic systems on democratic populations to disable our capacity for critical thinking and induce people to retreat to the safety of a strong leadership, a man on a white horse who presents himself as the only path to survival is to follow orders blindly and directly. And that doesn't work in a democracy. And what Roosevelt was watching at that time was the fear of the economic depression of the 1930s, which had been used by totalitarian leaders across Europe and really across the world, but in Spain and Italy and Germany, you had the rise of fascism in those countries, and in the Soviet Union and a lot of Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, etc., you had the rise of a different kind of totalitarianism, which was communism. But all of them were using the same formulas, the same algorithms of demagoguery to get people to voluntarily relinquish their Bill of Rights. Hitler did not take power by force. Germany was the most democratic country in Europe at that time and the most highly educated people. But using fear, he was able to disable their connections to their strongest, most deeply held values. And that's what Roosevelt was alluding to, that fear, because at that time in the United States, there was about 50% of our country were completely disillusioned with democracy and capitalism. They thought capitalism had failed, democracy had failed, we had to find a different system, and yet Huey Long, who had 30% of the vote, who was proposing a kind of communist type socialist populism, and you had Father Coughlin, who was more right-wing kind of populism, and you had a majority of American people at that time who were looking for other systems. And Roosevelt said to him, no, we're going to hold democracy together, and we're going to reform capitalism so that it serves the people. And you need to trust me, you need to stay with me, you need to participate in our democracy, and we need to go forward together. And don't stop thinking. You need to keep your mind open and your critical thinking skills honed. And that's what he was telling the American people to do, because fear is an instrumentality of totalitarianism. And we saw it this past year wielded by people that we trusted, people like Justin Trudeau, to impose systems that are completely antithetical to any kind of liberal tradition.
On the topic of fear, I think it's very easy to see once that settles into an individual or a population how it dislodges, as you say, critical thinking and distorts your perception and affects the kind of decisions you make, economic, psychological, moral. But one thing that I think we're also seeing is that people don't want to give up fear. Living in fear, in some sense, is a terrible way to live. And we know that there are physical correlates to this. You have high blood pressure and the physical effects of stress, and you're not really enjoying your life, you're not happy. It's not good to live in fear, or so we would think. And yet, it's been very clear, I think, throughout the pandemic, that when you try to present evidence to someone who is in this state of fear, that should assuage their fears, that should make them feel a little less afraid. And if you say things like, we have a pretty good set of pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals that treat COVID, or, the numbers aren't as bad for your age group as you seem to think, or none of this information seems to be met with anything other than anger. So I can't help but wonder, and what do you think about this? Do you think that people in some sense like living in fear? Is it part of human nature to like something about that? Do we lose something if we give it up?
I don't think so. With the way that I understand it is that the mechanisms for imposing orthodoxy are hardwired into the human neural systems, and they were hardwired into us during the 20,000 generations that human beings were wandering the African savanna in tiny groups, warring with their neighbors and struggling for survival. And the ones that survived were the ones that followed a strong leader, that they ascribed to a kind of a unified cosmology that gave them unit cohesion, which is a very potent weapon in war. And they saw people who were outside of that cohesive unit, outside of that belief system, as intractable enemies who were not even really human, who could be killed. And that people inside, anybody inside, no matter what their defects, they should be excused and overlooked. And that anybody on the outside was guilty no matter what they did. And it shuts off. Part of the mechanisms of orthodoxy is that it shuts off critical thinking. It shuts off your capacity to use logic to build bridges with the rest of humanity. So if somebody approaches you with a logical argument, to you they look like an enemy. They can't be listened to. They can't be debated. They have to be silenced. And the intelligence agencies and the other, elements of what I would call totalitarian elements, the people who study how to manipulate large populations, know exactly how to play on that hardwired system. The CIA, one of the things that I do in my book, and I really discovered while writing this book, and it's in the last chapter, which I think is the most important chapter of the book, and I talk about this event, which is Event 201. and most people, your audience probably knows about this. You can still shockingly look it up on YouTube. But it was a tabletop simulation of a coronavirus pandemic that was done in October of 2019. So think about that date, October of 2019. We first heard about coronavirus on January 1st, 2020. And then the pandemic was declared by WHO in March of 2020. But this is October 2019. But the intelligence agencies tell us that the coronavirus almost certainly escaped from the Wuhan lab prior to September 12th, 2019. How do we know that? Probably in late August or early September. How do we know that? Well, here's how. Here's why the intelligence agencies think that on the evening of September 12th, the Chinese military kicked down the door of the Wuhan lab and went in and changed the management, put a military commander in charge of the lab, removed 22,000 coronavirus samples that were on publicly interfacing websites and got rid of them, so nobody's seen them since. They also took most of the major gain-of-function studies out of the publicly facing websites. The satellite imagery shows that the 6 hospitals in Wuhan, that the parking lots were more filled than they'd been at any time during the previous 6 years. There were technicians from the lab who in the next 2 weeks went to the hospital with coronavirus symptoms. There was chatter on the internet all that day, September 12th, and escalating thereafter about masks and about the diarrhea or respiratory infections, and about the other symptoms that we now associate with COVID. And there were a number of other things that happened then and over the next month during the military games that make the intelligence agencies believe that the Chinese government knew about the escape beginning in September 12th. So a month later, you have this tabletop simulation in New York City at the Pierre Hotel. And who are the funders? The funders are Johns Hopkins University Security Center, which is funded by Bill Gates and NIH, the World Economic Forum, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are funding a coronavirus pandemic that killed 60 million people on the planet. The people who are attending the event are high-level ambassadors from the social media companies, from the major media companies, from the pharmaceutical industry, Johnson & Johnson, the biggest pharmaceutical companies, and from the military and big corporate PR firms. The hosts are Bill Gates, Avril Haines, who is the former deputy director of the CIA. Why is the CIA at a public health simulation? The CIA doesn't do public health. The CIA does coup d'etats. The CIA has been involved in 73 coup d'etats between 1947 and 2000. So that's a third of the countries on Earth. Why are they hosting a coronavirus pandemic simulation? The other peculiar person who is there as one of the hosts is George Gao, who is the head of the Chinese CDC. George Gao clearly knows that there is a coronavirus pandemic already happening. And that day, they do 4 simulations. And if you have time to look at it, you should look at the 4th one, because they spend the entire time talking about how to censor, how to get the social media sites to censor information that is contrary to government proclamations. Particularly, and this is what George Gao is pushing the entire time, again and again, he's saying we've got to shut people up if they start saying that this came from a lab leak. Oh, It is really a peculiar event, and so I spent a lot of time looking at it. What I found out is that this was not a one-off event, that they've been doing this virtually every year since 1999. And around that time, and particularly after 2001, after the World Trade Center attacks, if you remember, three weeks after the World Trade Center attack, we had an anthrax attack in our country. And it changed the entire U.S. foreign policy so that we adopted officially a biosecurity agenda as the spear tip of American foreign policy. And the biosecurity agenda is what was reflected across all of the agencies. And they began putting huge amounts of money into bioweapons. Now, we signed a bioweapon treaty in 1972, so we're not allowed to develop or research or stockpile or deploy bioweapons. But there's an exception. You can do the research and the stockpiling if it's for dual use. What does dual use mean? It means defensive uses. It means that when you're developing a bioweapon, you also are developing a vaccine. You cannot deploy any bioweapon without having a vaccine because of blowback. Because when you release a bioweapon, it's going to come back and infect your own people. So part of the strategy of having a bioweapon is to simultaneously develop a vaccine to give your own people so that you're only killing your enemy. So you're allowed to do the vaccine part because that's looked upon as defensive. So the Pentagon began putting billions of dollars into bioweapons research. But they didn't want to do it themselves because they believed the public would not believe that they were actually interested in vaccines. So they routed that money through Tony Fauci, and they gave him a 68% raise and a $2.2 billion annual budget to do bioweapons research. In 2014, 3 of his bugs escaped, and 300 scientists, leading bioweapons experts in the world, in America, Mark Lipsitch from Harvard, Richard Ebright from Rutgers, wrote a letter to President Obama asking them to shut down Tony Fauci's research because he was going to release a coronavirus that would cause a pandemic. And Obama sent a cease and desist order to Tony Fauci for his 18 projects that he was funding at that time to develop pandemic superbugs. Fauci defied that order and continued doing the research, but in order to hide the research from the White House, he started doing it, funding scientists to do that research at the Wuhan lab. And he had his U.S. scientist, Ralph Barrick, teach the Chinese military scientists how to develop coronavirus superbugs, and how to take the spike protein with the furin cleave and put it into harmless coronaviruses to make them deadly to humans. And he began doing that in 2014. He laundered the money through a British-born zoologist called Peter Daszak, again, to further hide it from the White House. Now, at the same time, the CIA, everybody knows now that Fauci was funding that work. What they don't know is the Pentagon, through DARPA and BARDA, began funding even more of it. So Fauci was giving millions of dollars. They were giving tens of millions. And the CIA was spending $100 million through USAID. So they were all researching it there, but they were also doing these simulations every year. And the simulations, the things that all these simulations have in common, they were secret. They were all orchestrated and written by the CIA. And there were high-level CIA officials or InQtel officials, which is the CIA's investment arm, at every one of them. Each one of the simulations, some of them had hundreds of thousands of people. They were they were doing it simultaneously in the United States, in Canada, and in Europe. And they were involving police, frontline workers, doctors, nurses, hospital systems, utilities, mayors, local leaders, FBI, and CIA and local police and all of the nations. They were doing it, and they were doing it secretly. And the thing they all have in common with Event 201 is they never talk about public health. They're not talking about how to get stockpile vitamin D and get it out to the public, and zinc to get out to the public. They're not talking about how to develop repurposed drugs, how to connect all of the 11 million physicians, frontline physicians from all over the world to figure out what's working, what are the protocols, what are the drugs that are working in Bangladesh and Zambia and Buenos Aires and France, and getting that information to doctors on the front line all over the world. There's nothing like that. There's no discussion about quarantining the sick and protecting the vulnerable. Nobody ever talks about any of that. Nobody talks about how do you protect constitutional rights during a pandemic. Every one of these simulations is about one thing. How do you use a pandemic to clamp down totalitarian controls and obliterate democracy in liberal democracies across the globe? The name of the series was called Operation Lockstep, because it was a way of training decision makers in nations in all the liberal democracies in the world, what they should do in a pandemic, how to use that pandemic to get rid of democracy globally. And they did it again and again and again. And all you have to do, if you read my book, it's cited in source. In some cases, you can go and look at these, you can read the transcripts, you can read the script. And it really was, to me, it was a breathtaking discovery. But I've been studying, because my family has had a 70-year battle fistfight with the CIA. I have written books about it, I've written articles about it, and about the agency, and about MK Ultra, and all of their mind control experiments over the years that were disclosed during the House Select Committee on Assassination hearings and during Frank Church's hearings during the 70s and 80s. And I paid a lot of money to get the CIA's manuals, not only for individual mind control, but Operation Artichoke and MK Ultra, but also all of the manuals that they use for how to do mass manipulation of populations. And if you look at it, and the CIA was studying how to manipulate populations for many, many years in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They were doing it at 173 universities and research centers in the United States, in Canada, and in Guatemala, including many, many Canadian, very, very prestigious Canadian universities that were involved in it. Sidney Gottlieb, who was their hypnotist and chemist, came out of the Canadian university system. So if you look at the techniques for mass control, what they were looking at was for individual control, hypnosis, psychotropic drugs, isolation, which was their most important, most potent weapon for imposing individual control, and other mechanisms for controlling individual humans. But they were also doing population control and how to use propaganda, orchestrated fear, isolating, separating people, obliterating economies, separating families, isolating individuals, shattering institutions in a society, and creating chaos and fear to the point where a majority of people would invite a centralized authority in to impose control from above. And that's what they were trying to orchestrate. There's two experiments that I'll just mention here. One is the isolation experiments, which were designed to induce a symptom that we now call Stockholm Syndrome. And Stockholm Syndrome is a syndrome where you lock people up and they become grateful to their captors. And they believe that the only way to escape alive is complete compliance and obedience to their captors. And they're kept in a constant state of fear and anxiety. So they become more and more obliged and compliant to their captors. And they also, one of the features of Stockholm Syndrome is the people who are locked up become angry with anybody who tries to help them escape, because they believe those people are jeopardizing their lives. Those people are going to anger the authorities. That's one of the syndromes that they study. The other thing that I connected for the first time to the CIA in my book is a famous experiment called the Milgram Experiment. And Stanley Milgram was a Yale professor. He ended up at City University in New York working for the former head of MK Ultra, who was his career patron. And Stanley Milgram recruited, as part of this experiment, people from every walk of life in America, students, professors, construction workers, blacks, whites, all kinds of people, business people. And he would bring the people and put them in the subject of the experiment, put them in a room where they would be seated at a table with a dial in front of them that they were told when they turned that dial, it would give an electric shock to a person who was in the next room, who was invisible to them, who was tied to a chair. They couldn't see that person. That person, in fact, was an actor who was a confederate of the study designers of Milgram. And in the room with the subject would be a man in a doctor's outfit. Mainly, it was Stanley Milgram, but there were other actors as well who played doctors, other researchers. And the doctor would tell them to give it a shock. And the shock, they could hear the person in the next room when they turned that dial, screaming, crying, pleading, struggling. And most of the people, most all of them, were reluctant to give it a second shot. The doctor would keep telling them, turn it up, turn it down, turn it up, turn it down, getting higher and higher and higher voltage. And in the end, and some of the people, some of the subjects were actually crying and pleading with Dr. Milgram not to make them do it again. But when he ordered them to do it, they would do it anyhow. And 67%, you can go on Wikipedia and look this up, the Milgram Experiment. 67% of the people, the subjects of that experiment, turned the dial up all the way to 450 volts, where it was marked potentially fatal. So the conclusion that Milgram says is that a figure of authority, particularly when they're dressed as a doctor, can overwhelm people's most deeply held values and judgment. And today, I feel like we're all caught in a massive Milgram experiment, where Tony Fauci is the doctor, or the Canadian Health Ministry and authorities, and the British, Chris Whitty. Each country had one of these doctors who would be telling them, I know what I'm doing, do what you're told. And most of the population will do what it's told. Even though it violates their values, even though they're tearing up the Constitution, which everybody knows you don't censor speech. Everybody knows you don't close churches. Everybody knows you don't ban jury trials. You don't get rid of the right to assembly. You had Justin Trudeau in your country getting rid of the right to petition by closing the bank accounts of people who have exercised their constitutional rights to assemble and to petition government. And everybody knows that's wrong, but they all went along with it because a doctor was telling them to do it. And, the good news about the Milgram experiment was that 33% of the people got up and walked out. And what I would say is the people in this room tonight, you're part of that 33%. And that our job is to fight for these rights, to hold the line, to fight back until the rest of the population wakes up and remembers their values and begins joining the revolution.
Well, thank you very much for that. I was going to ask you, what is the way out of this? Because it seems, as you're describing, this psychological experiment en masse, on a global scale, is not only incredibly successful, but I would imagine that those who have orchestrated it are surprised at how successful it has been. And that the people you describe, who are following these public health experts and feeling like they're doing something good and conforming, they don't see that they're doing something bad, right? They see that they are purifying, right? Their family, their loved ones, their country, the human race, whatever it is. And it seems like we have this kind of obsessive focus on purity in our culture these days. And, you mentioned the list of the people, the usual suspects, Bill and Melinda Gates and George Cao and Fauci and WEF. And we know that there are so many people like this on a global scale with immense power that are orchestrating these psychological effects that we're seeing every day. Are there people I have to ask, are there forces on the other side that are fighting against them? And if not, what is our best, a room full of hundreds of people, what is our best strategy? What can we do?
Well, Dr. Ponesse, what I kind of see is that we're currently in an arms race, and that, these totalitarian forces now have instrumentalities available to them that will give them ultimately total control. So even if you have 80 or 90% of the population in revolt, it won't matter, because the capacity to control us with technology is going to be so overwhelming. And, it's been the ambition and the intention of every totalitarian regime in the history of mankind to eliminate all dissent, to control every aspect of our behavior, from sexual behavior to creativity, to poetry, to any form of self-expression, because every form of self-expression ultimately is a form of dissent. And to control our movements, control our money, to control everything that we do. But no system in the world has been able to do that because they simply never had the technology to do it. Totalitarian regimes are always really good record keepers because that's the way to control people. But none of them could really have that capacity to have total record keeping and total control. Today they do that. They have that. I mean, if you look at all of the things that are now being put in place, 5G, 5G, which I sued the FCC and the FDA on the 5G issue, and we've won that suit. So we're in now, they've appealed it. And we won in the Court of Appeals so far. And because it's so dangerous, and the danger, it destroys human tissue, it destroys neuronal cells. It causes cancer, it causes birth defects, it causes all kinds of immune problems, and it's really, really dangerous and highly, highly toxic. But the point, the reason that they're spending trillions of dollars laying out the 5G, if you see these ads on TV that say 5G is about to come to your neighborhood, and there are these glossy ads and they're exciting, and you watch those and you say, gosh, that's going to be great when it finally gets here. My life is finally going to change. I'm finally going to be happy now when I have 5G. But then you think about it and say, what is it going to do for me? I'm going to be able to download a video game 2 seconds faster. That's the point. It's not going to do anything for you. It's what it's going to do for them. It's going to allow them to have driverless cars and AI so that, and Elon Musk himself has said, AI is going to start by stealing your job and then it's going to kill you. That's what he says about it, and he's one of the big promoters of it. But the real purpose of AI, two other purposes, are one, data collection. The corporations and the government have been able to have access to your data for a long time, all of your data, because they're listening to you on your Apple Watch, on your GPS, on your cell phone, through your microwave oven, if it's smart. All your smart devices in your household are listening to you, and they know every time you cough, every time you sneeze. They know when you talk about buying a new mattress or a new set of shoes. All of that data has value, but they have not been able to harvest it till now. But 5G gives them the capacity to harvest it. Everything about you, they're going to know. They have total knowledge of everything that you do. And Bill Gates is currently building a city in Arizona of 85,000 people. It is simply one huge data analytics center where they're going to be able to take all of this data. Siri is not working for you. I mean, just disabuse you. Your Apple Watch is not working for you. It's working for Bill Gates. And it's tracking and reporting every little thing you do. And he's going to be able to take that data and subject it to analytics and monetize it and then sell it to companies or use it himself. He has, within 5 years, there's going to be 415,000 low altitude satellites. Gates will own 65,000 of them. He says that his 65,000 satellites alone will be able to look at every square inch of the planet 24 hours a day. There's no place to hide. The data analytics, the 5G does data analytics, but allows them to harvest and monetize everything you do. But it also allows total surveillance. They connect with the satellites, they connect with the facial recognition systems. They know where you are 24 hours a day. They know everything that you do. They follow you on your GPS. They look at all your transactions. At the same time, they're bringing in digitalized currency. And the purpose of the digitalized currency is that they're going to be able to track, trace, and tax every transaction that you do. And but also, they have programmable currency, which they use now in China. And the first use of it in the Western world was by Justin Trudeau, during the trucker strike, where if you disobey one of their mandates, like, let's say all of these powers they're taking, they're never going to give up. So they're saying to you now, yeah, the lockdowns are over. But they're reserving the ability to do a lockdown anytime they want and do masking, et cetera. So let's say they have a masking week where everybody has to wear a mask this week, and they see you on facial recognition. You're not wearing a mask, or you're supposed to be social distancing and you got too close to your girlfriend. They then can punish you the way that Justin Trudeau did without ever charging anybody with a crime, without ever convicting them. They can shut off your capacity to spend money. So they can tell you, okay, for the next 2 weeks, you have to stay home and your credit cards will only work at grocery stores within a half mile of your home. If you try to travel elsewhere, you can't buy gas, you can't buy an airplane ticket, you can't do anything else. And that is total control of the population. And then they have the vaccine passports, which, of course, like in China, will be attached to a social credit system. So if you're a person that the government disapproves of, if you speak out, if you don't comply, they then can punish you using their digitalized currency. So they have all these instrumentalities of control that they're putting in place now. And I call it turnkey totalitarianism, because they're building the whole system. And when they turn it on, it's going to be too late. At the same time, the resistance is growing, and it's growing exponentially. The conversions are always from them to us. People come over to our side. Nobody goes back into the matrix. And we're essentially in an arms race today where we're building the resistance fast enough that we can dismantle the system before they turn it on and put it in place. And that's really that's really the race that we're in right now. And, we're getting these pockets of resistance in the red states in the United States that are where you have political leaders who are saying, we're not going to do it. And they're passing laws saying you can't do it. And the same thing is happening to some extent in Canada and in other nations in the world where there's a resistance going, where they're actually putting safeguards in the law. The last thing that I would leave you with is this, these rules that everybody should remember. Number one, that every power that the government takes, it will never relinquish voluntarily. The masking, the social distancing, the lockdowns, they may shut off for a temporary time, but they're going to hold on to them and they will use them against you whenever they want to. So we need to confront them and take those powers away from them. Number two, every power they take, they will abuse to the maximum extent possible. This is a law of history. It's a law of human nature. If they're allowed to do something bad to you, they will do it, ultimately. The third rule is that nobody has ever complied their way out of totalitarianism. Every time you are obedient, the bullies take that as a sign of weakness and a signal that they can impose some new humiliation, on you, some new task. And so, our duty is to resist. And if you think, I'm not going to die on this hill, think again. This is a hill today that you need to die on, because every time they back you up, they get stronger and stronger. And we are as strong as we're going to get right now. And we need to hold the line until some of the other side begins to join us.
There's there's so much richness in that, and I wish we could talk for longer. You're going to come back tomorrow night, right? We'll carry on the conversation.
Sure.
Do you know?
Canada, I wish I could be there.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one last quick thing, and you can make it very quick, and it's a little bit of a personal question, but I'm wondering, could you imagine if you were able to assemble for dinner all the family that you've lost over the last 50, 60, 70 years? What would that conversation look like, do you think? What would they say about our world? What would they say to you about your view, your stance?
I've made a practice my whole life of not speaking for my father, my uncles, or anybody else who has died. So, I think all of them were people who loved democracy. They loved freedom. They were people who mistrusted power, who understood that people in power lie. My father specifically told me that. He said, people in power lie. You have to remember that. And so I think that they understood that everybody has to, our job in democracy is to approach power with skepticism and to keep asking questions and to keep our minds unclouded by fear or by any of the other alchemies of demagoguery that, these autocratic elements and these oligarchs, use to control and disable a population.
Well, I'm sure that you've left our audience, you've certainly left me with an awful lot to think about tonight, running the spectrum from COVID to government in general, to psychology, to morality, to just what we can do with our own minds. And as you say so eloquently and importantly, what is the hill to die on anyway? And if this is not it, then there isn't going to be another one, right? And I just thank you so much for your time and your ideas and for sharing them. And I think we're immensely grateful. So thank you. Everybody, give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much.